Panosophers Podcast, a podcast on Rosicrucianism, Hermeticism, and the teachings of the Western Esoteric tradition, where adepts, practitioners, researchers share their views.
Hello, friends and listeners, and welcome to a new episode of the Panosophers Podcast. The Panosophers Podcast, which is also a new branding of the Thoth-Hermes podcast, of course, which you can find on the channels of panosophers.com, on all the outlets for the podcasts that you possibly know, and also on Thoth-Hermes and its channels all over the place. So this is episode 4 of the Panosophers Podcast, and today is the 1st of December. Yes, it's already the last month of the year, 1st of December 2024, and my guest here today is Mark Stavish. Mark, who probably most of you know, who is the founder and the director of the Institute for Hermetic Studies in Pennsylvania, and we will also talk a little bit how that institute came into being, because with that institute, Mark and his people there, they are preserving lots of the traditions that all of us who are interested in the occult, into the esoteric Western tradition, cherish, like, work with, need, use. Of course, there is always development in those things, and we here at Panosophers, we know about that development quite well, because that's part of our work that we do with the panosophers.com website, with the teachings that will be out there soon in a month or two, teaching courses that we are going to provide for you there, with the blog that has been existing for quite some years, our friend Sam Robinson has created and so well maintained, and which is now open to many interesting bloggers around who talk about Rosicrucianism, Hermeticism, etc. Well, coming back to Mark Stavish and his institute, Hermeticism, of course, as the name of the institute says, is at the core of their interests and of their work. And today with Mark, I'm going to speak about tradition and what it means, like we always do when we talk. Mark and I have done several talks on the Thoth-Hermes podcast already. We start with some point, and then he's so knowledgeable, and we start discussing things, and it ends up maybe in a completely different layer of the interest. But it's highly interesting, that talk that we're going to hear and that I was able to have with him. And I really hope you will enjoy that. And of course, as always, you are used to, from the Thoth-Hermes podcast and also now at the Panosophers podcast, we also play some music. And my musical guest, so to speak, here today is somebody who is a fervent listener of those podcasts and who has already been providing some music for an earlier episode of Thoth-Hermes, Carl Jung. He plays the bamboo flute, but also produces music where the bamboo flute is always featured, but has also some other instruments, but in the same vein. It's more Easterly music. Japanese bamboo flute has a very typical sound, and Carl Jung is going to be our musical guest and provider here today. The first piece that we are going to hear is called Forest Flower, and all 3 pieces that we hear here today are from his released CD, which is called Lost in the Wood. Lost in the Wood, a highly interesting project where he does not only play the Japanese bamboo flute, but he is integrating it into very typical, specific type of music. I hope you're going to enjoy that. Well, right after Forest Flower, that first piece of music, we are going to delve right away into the interview with Mark. And somehow in the middle of the interview, about after 42 minutes or so into the interview, we'll do a little musical break again. I'll come back to you and we'll tell you about the other two pieces that we're going to hear. But for now, listen to Forest Flower and then to the first part of my talk with Mark Stavish. Enjoy.
Here comes the interview.
Mark Stavish, it's great to have you back here on the podcast, and this time same setup, but a different name of the brand, Panosophers Podcast this time, but in a well-known surrounding. It's great to have you back here and to talk today about how we experience, let's put it that way, how we do experience esotericism, occultism in our world today, and what you think, where it's going, how it should be going, and where it comes from. Well, all that kinds of things, large subjects. So greetings and great to have you back.
Oh, it's always wonderful to be here. I was just earlier today, I was thinking of one of our previous discussions, and they're just wonderful.
Oh, well, thank you. Same here. I think it's the 5th time or so that we are doing this. And sometimes we also meet just a little bit like that without recording and have a chat. And when we did that last time, an idea came up to do this interview here with words like tradition in occultism, but maybe tradition is not even a good word because it's very branded in some respect or so. You, with the Institute for Hermetic Studies and your people there, you have created a point where all those things gather, where they come together. And I wonder if we could start our conversation here today a little bit with the history and the idea behind the Institute, how it all came together, why you started that, and how it works today and what it is.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's great. It's funny because I just had to review some of that information because one of our volunteers said, "Hey, you don't have a wiki page." I said, no, we don't. Feel free to write it. So they did, and they sent it to me to go over and add stuff and correct things. And really what had happened is it was the 90s. Things were, as you know, they were rolling. It was just a spectacularly open time for esotericism and occultism and all things magical. And there was an explosion in the world, not only in terms of publishing, where you see Llewellyn is really taking off. Red Wheel Wiser is, well, Red Wheel still, and it's gotten like a second or third wind. It's just doing so very well. Media is picking up on the notion of magic, and we see quite a few films and some series taking place at this time, television shows, and it becomes an increasingly dominant theme. And then we have Gnosis Magazine, which was a kind of a focal point of so many things and activities, because yes, at the time we still really had to rely on publications, but we're seeing more of them on the newsstand. Things that you would never have heard of, almost like fanzine style publications. And if those who remember what a fanzine was, this is something you made in your basement with a photocopier or a mimeograph machine and maybe some colored paper. And you did a lot of cut and paste to do the artwork because there weren't any art programs to draw with. And you would go out of your way to find some of these because they were quite interesting. But now they're popping up on newsstands, and they're popping up with better quality. It's still not what we know now with print on demand. There's still a lot of heavy investment in terms of resources, but that's changing. And then suddenly we have what's called the internet. And with the internet, access to a whole bunch of things changes dramatically. Not quite what it is now, but it's starting. So you still needed to go places at the time. You didn't have the advantages of Zoom or what we have now. You still needed to go places. And we had a workshop in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania at the Elks Lodge, which is no longer there. And it was on alchemy. It was Russ House and Sue House from the Philosophers of Nature. They came and presented, or Russ came and presented. And it was a very nice event. And I said to folks, if you have any interest in some kind of local study group, let us know. Some time went by, you hear things from people. And then sometime in March 1st, I think it was, I'd have to check the date, 1998, we had an organizational meeting at a Econo Lodge, I think it was, in Wilkes-Barre Township on 309. The only place I could find that had a reasonably priced meeting room.
Of course, yeah. So
that's where
do.
That's right. We needed a room for 14, 15 people, right? And we discussed what would happen, and it started the next month. And then for every other week, twice a month, first and third Sunday of each month, we'd meet at 10 a.m. till 1 p.m. And we'd have a session of presentation and ritual work. Okay, so there'd be lecture and ritual. And that went on for quite a few years. And that became the basis of our book, which we would later publish, called Light on the Path, which is the full 4-year curriculum that we used in that time frame.
And that's still around, that book, or?
That book, yeah, many people asked for it, and we self-published it. It was really, I think, one of our first adventures in self-publishing, because we had the material, but it wasn't a kind of book that would have any economic viability. I mean, Weiser's not going to publish it. Welland's not. So we had to POD it. That's the only way we could get it out there.
Sure.
So print on demand was a fabulous technology for books like that have an audience, just not a large audience, or one in which, and for those of you who are listening, you've got a group of your own, you've got some kind of activity going on. You may need as few as 15 or 20 copies, but you want it to look nice.
Mm-hmm.
You don't just want to have it be photocopied and staple bound or spiral bound. I mean, those can be well done. I've seen wonderful editions of that, but you know what I'm talking about. You want it to look like a book or a workbook.
Sure.
POD technology is great for that. Very inexpensive, looks very nice. So we took advantage of that and we published it, and you can get it now from Amazon. It's on Amazon Prime. And of course, we send it out to people who ask for it in different situations. So it gives you a complete curriculum to follow. And that was the idea. Look what we did. This is how we did it. There's some things you can change. We show you, like, these are like the options, like take one from column A, one from column B, or just skip. Just do one column or the other, or column C, right?
Right.
And this way you could learn, at least it would give you an idea as to how to create or develop a curriculum that would go from the beginning to the middle to the end.
So say again the title, exactly.
Light on the Path. Light on the Path.
Mm-hmm.
And, so it wouldn't be open-ended. And people would know kind of where they're going with their group coursework. So it was meant to give people a mechanism for education.
Mm.
So anyhow, we did the group. We had a lot of people from New York coming in, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, DC, that is. And they're driving quite a bit, a huge commitment to come in.
Yeah.
9/11 rolls around. That has a tremendous impact on attendance because our folks coming out of those areas, and many of them are involved in disaster recovery.
Okay.
So they're bringing, New York back up online. So we don't see them. We continue on. We have some very good seminars and workshops on El Kohen, on alchemy, on mineral alchemy, plant alchemy. And at some point, I recognized things were looking a little unstable. So what I did is set up the Louis Call de Saint Martin Fund, or the LCSM Fund, at the Luzerne Foundation. And what this was is we took some of the money that we had and we put it in this fund. And that way we knew that at least we had done something with our time here,
Mm.
and that we would allow that fund to grow. And we managed to get quite a few good donations to it over the years. I don't know. It's not of high value now. I think it's around $35,000 or $40,000 in value now. And for those of you who understand funding, that means you can take 5% out a year. So what that 5% a year, if we do the math on that, it's not much. But what we did over the years is we were able to provide money to libraries and to institutions for conferences and events. And we were able to do something with it, which was the point. What are we doing with this?
Yeah.
And that's what we did. So this continues. By this time, we had changed the name from the Wyoming Valley Society for Esoteric Studies, which we started out with that name, and we changed it to the Institute for Hermetic Studies. And we just continued to grow. And by 2011, I believe it was, 2012, we had a huge event that we were invited to give up in near Plattsburgh, New York, in Panama, New York. Had over 40 people there. It was very nice. And someone took a phone and slapped it down in front of me and recorded the 2 days. Well, this was great because we took that recording and that became Unfolding the Rose. So when you go to our coursework, essentially that is the recording from that presentation that you get. I had also given that same presentation, more or less. It was the same one. I think it was a week earlier or maybe a week later at Johannes Kelpius Lodge of the Rosicrucian Order Amorc in Ulster, Mass. I gave it up there. So after that recording, we said, hey, we got to record these things and then we can find a way to make them available. So we were making them available to folks on CDs. We'd burn CDs and send them out to them, put the labels on, the way it was done. We'd send them the notes, the lecture notes in spiral bound, right? And people did very well. So they liked it. We eventually would have all of our courses on YouTube for free. That would get vandalized, destroying a lot of the material. So that's why we have 2 YouTube sites, one of which we can't access, but it has partial content on our material. And then when we were able to get everything back together again, we then said, okay, let's put this all on Teachable. Let's put this behind a paywall.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons we did behind the paywall is because, and this is going into what we'll be talking about, you can't run on air.
Yeah.
We were doing stuff for free for 20 years, almost, for very little cost. And at some point you just run out of resources.
Sure.
And resources means money. You run out of money and people.
Of course.
So to prevent that, we had to re-examine what we were doing. Teachable became a very useful platform for doing that in part. Now our website is being redone as well. We have a second YouTube page, which is accessible. Has a lot of interviews up there that we've done with folks and short, brief presentations that were really good, really enjoyable, and worth keeping alive because I would go locally to somewhere and give a presentation. We'd have 20 people show up, and that was nice. But, when you do an hour and a half and it's just right. You know what it's like as a performer. It's just right. You don't want to just let it go.
Yeah.
So we'd say, hey, let's put it on YouTube and let anyone watch it because it's good. Let's keep it alive.
Absolutely.
So that's kind of how we got to where we're at. And sometime in the meantime, there was the beginning of extended self-publishing of different materials that, again, very useful materials, but materials that didn't have any commercial value. And that's really important to understand because it takes a lot of time and energy to produce a book, even the small monographs that we would do. And publishers are not going to publish that if they don't think this has longevity. And that usually that comes down to anywhere, depending on the title, 500 to 3,000 copies per year being sold. So if it's not selling, it doesn't stay in print, no matter how good it is, no matter how many translations there may be. And we saw that with my second book, Kabbalah for Health and Wellness. I got to tell you, I think that's just a spectacular book on Kabbalah, approaching it from several angles that are often ignored. It's in several translations, but we had to then put it back ourselves, put it back in English because Llewellyn just let it go.
Yeah. Well, you were touching already until that stage of the Institute, a lot of typical situations, problems, I think, that people face. Mm-hmm. It's funny you're saying that about the 90s and the pop-up stuff then back then. It's a little bit the feeling I had in my business in the performing arts, especially in, opera and classical music, which I do, or I did. That was also the big time. And with the early 2000s, maybe because of 9/11, but maybe that's just part of some other development, things changed completely and became, in a way, less creative and much more difficult. And I think we are touching the same situation here with the occultism that we like, right? How would you define the occultism that you like? What would be the adverb you give to that? Traditional, or is it whatever? What's the word that you would give to it?
And I think it's difficult to say because for me, being exposed to this at a very young age, and in my early teens, not my late teens, in my early and mid-teens, being exposed to people who'd been doing it, in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, a whole different time. They bring a whole different gravitas to it, a whole different weight, a whole different seriousness. Mm-hmm. And being exposed to people who were they were opening up or revealing to me an Indian yogic approach that was from a time that's now gone.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking mid-70s, right?
Oh, no. They had been, that's when I would have been exposed to it in the early 80s, but they were exposed to it in the 20s, the 30s.
Oh, you mean
in India, and in not only that, but in its context.
Yeah.
So in a cultural continuity, a cultural context that's long gone. So, with that being said, I would say that my notion of occultism very much has to do with it's about relationships.
Mm-hmm.
It's very much relationship oriented.
Mm-hmm.
It's who do you know, and why do you know them, and why do they bother to spend any of their precious capital or time with you, and then why do you bother to spend any of yours with them? Mm-hmm. So the notion for me of esotericism is what is the gateway to that, and the gateway to that mm-hmm. is exoteric. It's outer.
Yeah, sure.
And what is that outer environment? Well, part of it I see as cultural. And then within that context of cultural, it's human. There's a human element. So for me, the human element was always there because there was no other way. So when I would meet people who had some level of authority or responsibility in different groups or who were authors, it was a big deal because they weren't simply easy to get to.
And you were speaking about meeting them in person, of course.
In person. Yes. Mm. They weren't easy to get to.
Yeah.
Or someone would give you a piece of information or a teaching on something. If you knew them well and you knew what they were capable of, you took that little bit of information very, very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
It was almost like the equivalent of to kind of give a slight exaggeration, but it's kind of like a vitamin or a little grain of the philosopher's stone. It's really small, but its impact, if done properly, if absorbed, can have a tremendous impact on you.
And that little thing contains the whole, in a way, in the Hermetic sense, right?
That's exactly it. That it could unfold if you paid attention to it. And that's what we were always taught, again and again, always paying attention to the fundamentals.
Mm.
Within the fundamentals is contained everything else, if you were paying attention.
Right.
So we move out of that, and that is kind of, I guess, the way of describing the esotericism I like, where it is about what do we hold in common, which brings us together so that we can grow as individuals, but within that same framework, grow as a group, as something that we are creating, not just for ourselves alone or for this moment in time so that we can feel good about who we are and pat ourselves on the back because we're among the elite spiritual group and not like those terrible muggle mundanes or Callans or whatever we want to call them, right? But what are we doing that is going to have a positive ripple effect into the future, right? Into our children's generation, our grandchildren's generation, and maybe, if you're really lucky, the next one.
Yeah.
Because that's what we inherited. I inherited what all these other people had done, in which they had inherited what was done. So therefore, there's that sense of, within the esotericism, there was always that sense of, what is your duty? What is your obligation? What is your duty here? Rather than, what can I get out of it?
I think that's a highly important point that you just said, because also when you, as you just described it, get something from a person that was there before you. So when you have a teacher, to call it like that, you don't, you take a responsibility with the knowledge or the wisdom or the things you get from that person, an obligation to carry it forward in life and to develop it also, don't you?
Well, I think if you're a person of any moral and ethical value, you're going to assume that I have a responsibility here, that if this is important enough for me, then I have a certain obligation to ensure that it, whatever it happens to be, it continues into the future. This body of wisdom, this body of knowledge, this body of practice.
That is the literal sense of the word tradition. Yeah, the literal sense from the Latin word tradere, right? To transport from the past into your time and possibly into the future to carry it on. But when you talk,
and I'm not afraid of the word tradition, just not afraid of the word discrimination, as a virtue on the path. We've played with these words too much to make people comfortable. The reality is we should be making them uncomfortable. That way they get a sense of where they need to look themselves. And when we think of tradition, we have to just, as you said, the carrying forward. And another word of that we have to use interchangeably with it, continuity and sustainability.
Yeah.
We may want to, we might splice on those words a little bit and say they're not quite exactly the same, but they're really talking about the same thing and moving in the same direction. So we can splice them together like threads into a rope if we want to. We can do that.
And that creates longevity, right? Altogether. Right. So what does tradition in the sense of occultism mean to you, Mark Stavish, as a person? What does it mean to you?
It means that you have a relationship with people in the past who have given you something and which you have received, which through your own practice you have found to be of such significant value in your life that you are going out of your way to ensure that it is taught to at least one or two other people so that it in turn will survive. Because the theory here is, what are we doing it for? And if our goal is what we'll call spiritual illumination, then the notion must be either you have achieved this state of illumination, and we'll say here, that means a certain freedom from the constraints of duality. In simple terms, we think of that in terms often of reincarnation. Okay? So if you really believe in reincarnation, which so many of our people say they do, then it is critical to you to make sure that these ideas move forward. Otherwise, what's to say they're going to be there for you? to pick up where you left off.
Yeah.
And if you don't care enough about them to see that they survive, then why do you do them at all? Just go do something else. Go play tennis. Go play pinball. Or go play solitaire on your computer.
If you do it for selfish reasons, it can even turn things worse, can't it?
Yeah, yes, I was. And I was thinking about that today. It's kind of a peculiar thing because I remember Jean Dubuis had mentioned something in one of his very brief essays about if the opening of the different Sephirotic centers, in the tree of life. Okay, and that gets tricky, but he said, if Tiferet, which we associate with the heart so much, the heart,
right,
is difficult to open in excess. It's difficult, maybe not even possible to have it too open. I'm not sure about that. I think that, but that's not the point. But if it's not open enough, it can lead to a kind of sense of obsession with black magic. Now, he never really elaborated on that. I thought, what exactly does he mean? I knew enough of him and I knew his thinking process. Say, what does he mean? Oh, okay, I get it. We often think of these things in very concrete terms, something open, closed, like a binary, open, closed. And it's not. It's a little bit of energy here, a little bit of energy here. It's like lukewarm over here, really hot over here, cold over here.
Right.
Tepid here. And it's like someone playing a piece on the piano. Wow, that was really good right up until there, and that was really bad. Some things you're good at, some things you're still learning. So if someone has an open heart center, what we're saying is they have a sense of self. What we're saying is they have a sense of self that is looking beyond just, they're looking at the invisible world. And what is the invisible world? But it is the domain of causes. The physical world is a domain of effects. The spiritual dimension is the domain of causes. So if someone is spending their time looking at the domain of causes, but they're still just focused on what's in it for me, that's what he's referring to. If you're not understanding that your relationship, what is the expansion of that? So you understand your relationship to those around you, to other human beings, to the animals. Oh, wait a minute. To the plants. Oh, wait a minute. To the dead, to the ghosts. Oh, wait a minute. To these archangels and angels or saints. If we're not opening ourselves up as a sphere, just really natural expression, like inflating a balloon, really. It's as natural as inflating a balloon. And in many ways, I'm sure they're similar because of just the effects. Many people know pranayama. You just do that and eventually everything's going to inflate anyhow. So as that expansion takes place, you realize your relationship to things. And that's what we're coming down to. It's about relationships. What is my relationship to myself? And then from that, what is my relationship to, as I understand it? And then what is my relationship to those around me? So when someone is in that point of they're very concerned about the world of causes, it's often easy to get caught up in a very narrow sense of self. And we kind of see that, or a sense of purpose of it, I should say, a sense of purpose. And we kind of see that with Hinayana Buddhism, where they're really, and of course, this is the theory, as the theory goes, that its main focus is individual liberation, not necessarily even enlightenment, just liberation from suffering. Okay, fine. And then, of course, the Mahayanas will say, yeah, but we're concerned, we have compassion for everybody. Okay, that's fine too. But I'm just trying to throw this out there as ways of beginning to see that these ideas are not new, they're already out there. Right. And we need to reflect on them. So I hope that was kind of long and involved, but I hope that answers it.
No, it was clear. I have two questions for that. You were explaining that, well, it's starting by yourself and other people, then animals, plants, etc. And you compared it to a balloon. Well, when you said it, I'm more than a balloon, which is one thing that expands. I rather saw layers. So where's for you the difference? Is it layers, or is it really one thing that expands into all those domains, into all those realms? When you imagine it?
I think it's both. I don't think it's one or the other, because there's only one thing that's expanding anyhow. What's happening is we're perceiving things differently as it's happening.
Sure. Yeah.
And it goes back to the old story of they say the crystal, right? That the light hits the crystal and then it creates a prism, right? But it's all one light. So
it's all one light. Sure.
You can't really separate them out. I think that's how we have to look at it in that regard. Because otherwise, then we get into this thing. This is the death of Kabbalah. This is like, you should just like take all your Kabbalah books and just put them in the furnace and stay warm in wintertime if this is what's going to happen. Is it gets very, very caught up in these looking at the different spheres or levels as almost discrete entities.
Yeah.
And it creates this very concrete notion of how things interact.
Mm.
And it's not that concrete.
That would be stiff, wouldn't it?
It's not that stiff. It's not that rigid. Yeah. But we've all experienced it, and we know people who have as well.
Sure. What does you just said if you are a moral and ethical person, you just said before, right? But doesn't every development, every esoteric occult development start with developing your ethical values, your moral values, in order to then receive the knowledge in a different way and use it in a different way? Isn't that the base of everything?
In theory, but not in practice.
Yeah.
And I think that we can see that by the way modern esotericism simply is taught versus classical or medieval or Renaissance. Mm-hmm. When we look at the notion of the virtues and vices attributed to the spheres on the tree of life, very few people talk about them. They're seen as
talk about them.
Well, the virtue is virility. It's power itself. It's an inherent power. Mm-hmm. In the classical sense, if you were a virtuous person, you were a strong, virile man. You're one filled with potency. Okay. And again, the words potency, power, okay, virility, power, there's an energy to it. And in fact, this is a good way we can look at different esoteric practitioners today and say that, for God's sake, eat a Snickers bar. There is no power behind them.
Right.
They're weak. They're whiny. They're complaining.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Not only
they're not heroes.
Yeah.
They're not heroes. They're not esotericists. So we can't even say they're on the path, but there they are cluttering up the airwaves with TikTok videos and all sorts of things, which this is serious. I mean, I don't want to come off as the curmudgeon here, but this is a serious point.
Indeed.
It is that the notion of your growth as a person in terms of your inner self-awareness, your inner self-realization, then presents itself, that realization is moved into action. We're in asaya, the world of action. That action becomes self-actualization. Self-realize, self-actualize. And in that moment of action, which is again karma's action, you have then presented the reality of truth.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just an abstraction. It's just an idea. And when abstractions and ideas, particularly idealism, when idealism goes bad, it goes toxic and it goes real bad. So
why is that?
Because when you have a really good idea, a plan about how things should or ought to be, and the rest of the world or particular nature isn't going along with that, well, you're not wrong. I can't be wrong here. It's not me.
Yeah.
All of you were wrong. You didn't accept the new truth. You didn't accept the new gospel. You didn't accept it. You're the undesirable.
Yeah.
Because idealism is an archetype. It's a rigid archetype is what it is.
Right.
And then as that archetype kind of has to get solidified in the world of action, you're dealing with a lot of moving parts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a very good example, we'll go back to that, is something you're familiar with, which is music. we have a song, and that song is written down in musical notation. And that musical notation in its own way is perfect, but it is silent.
Mm-hmm.
And it's written down at a time and a place where now time has gone on. It's 100 years later, it's 200 years later. We have no recordings of it. We may not even know what the actual instrument sounded like because composition of the strings may have changed. Tightness on the strings may have changed.
The rooms in which it's performed have changed.
I just want to get at then the very room itself changes. I sing wonderfully in the shower, courtesy of that stuff.
And of course, and here I speak as a musician, also the auditive capabilities of the audience have changed, or just what they are used to hearing.
Then we get into, then that's a whole sub-cycle is just a communication loop of sound processing and what goes on in the stimuli response notion of communication.
All right.
Now, when we get to the notion of the individual performer, and even if it's someone, a singer, what is their vocal capacity? What is their lung capacity?
Mm.
I'm amazed when I found out, when I really was able to talk to someone who was trained in Moscow about what is really involved in terms of the physical aspect of singing, the physicality. It was really stunning. So that, and someone like wonderful performers who they sing so well, and there's several in rock genre who most would be aware of, who they didn't treat their voices well. And then later on, their capacity begins to diminish because they didn't have the proper training to take care of their voice well. So between the limitations of the performer, whether it be technical in terms of voice or technical in terms of playing the instrument, or technical in terms of their physiology, all of these things affect then that archetype, the performance of that archetype we call music.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good way of looking at then how when you have an idea, and I think a good example, the perfect ideal is twofold. We've brought it up in the past: National Socialism, a utopian ideal, and communism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, communism among our folks, because they're idealists, often gets a free pass, but it murdered more people.
Yeah.
It murdered a lot more. And that's a hard truth for many to swallow. They don't want to hear that.
Yeah.
Because that's part of where we get into what are we here for? We're trying to understand reality as it is. And then you pay attention. And here, I'll give you an example. He said communism murdered more people. Is he saying National Socialism's okay?
Yeah.
They're horrified. That kind of twitchiness. Again, that's the twitchiness why we have to push people to be uneasy, so that they can then allow themselves to rise up and see their own biases and predilections. And that only happens in a structured environment where traditional initiation would push you to your limits. Traditional initiation was kind of a controlled trauma. And for those familiar with, Masonic initiation, which of course is easily available for any of you to research, is a very perfect example of that. And it's a wonderful one because those of us who have gone through it realize, that was no big deal. But at the time, it's so well done. If it's well done, it's like it's bringing up all these emotions in you and these thoughts. What's that? And
definitely.
And that's why I say, ask me what kind of occultism or esotericism like. That's why I say traditional, because we have to now find ways to not only get people to pay attention to their virtues and enhance their virtue standing, not virtue signaling, but their real strength, their real inner capacity, and at the same time come to grips with their own biases, no matter how subtle they may be, and do that in a manner that is really going to be disturbing to them. It's going to be traumatic, no matter how gently it's done because you're shaking up the system somehow. And it's emotional in nature generally. And that helps them put themselves back together again.
And we are now taking a small short break from our talk with Mark. Highly interesting, I believe, and I hope you're enjoying it just as much as I do. We return to the music of Carl Jung now, as I promised, and those pieces 2 and 3, we are going to hear the second piece, which is going to be played now, and then after the second part of the interview, which follows right away after that piece of music, there will be a third piece, of course, as always. And both those pieces are highly Japanesely influenced, even by their titles. So the piece that you're going to hear now is called Yamagoe. And the third one, the shortest one after the interview, Murasaki Muraiki. So, of course, Japanese bamboo flute is at the core of those pieces, and Carl Jung, our listener of this podcast and a highly interesting and very creative musician, is our musical guest here today. Why don't we jump right into that piece, Yamagoe, and then go back and listen to the second part of the talk with Mark Stavish about tradition and many other things, followed by Murasaki Muraiki. And do not go away, because after the third piece of music, of course, as always, not only I will tell you goodbye, but also I will tell you who will be my guest next week. do you think that we live in a time where all that we just said and we're discussing and speaking about has become more difficult than it used to be when you were in your mid-teens? Or is it because you have started thinking more and have, with more experience, of course, also maybe a bigger insight in things? And if it has become more difficult, why would that be? But maybe let's first answer the first question. Is it more difficult at this age? We all say the age of Aquarius has started, and it's become a more spiritual age of our existence. But why does it feel so hard with all the internet and all that we have? Why does it feel so hard to get to the bottom of things in occultism?
I think because, again, it goes back to idealism. When we were hearing a lot of these ideas, we were reading about these ideas that people had written about them maybe in the post-war period and in the interwar period. And that's important to understand how much that affected their view. Those traumatic experiences were so horrible that they wanted to, and that's why you see this constant emphasis on one world government and one world religion, particularly in the 20s and 30s and in the early 40s and 50s, why you see so much emphasis on that. And the idea that a united nations is going to be the solution to all our problems. And that we can educate a spiritual elite. And that was just a wonderful idea that never had any traction for real on any positive way and wasn't going to happen. But the people in these movements really wanted it because, again, it was in response to the trauma exosphere. And I really just can't emphasize that enough. I just can't. I don't think there's having grown up with people who survived those periods, and you as well, a lot of folks don't really understand it, what we're talking about. So we want to prevent this from ever happening again. So esotericism is a natural, and spirituality of various forms, which again, on its most superficial level, is a very sophisticated form of psychology, such as depth psychology and transpersonal psychology. And on a more slightly less superficial level, but still important, is just the idea that I want to look at the world of causes and not effects. And there we're going to see early psychic research and parapsychology and that kind of thing. But remember, it's really still very close to the earth, I want to say. It's all sublunar. It's very sublunar to put it in occult terms.
Yeah.
Okay. It never really penetrates much beyond the veil.
Right.
So that trauma is driving this, and it makes a perfect idealistic union with media, with psychology, with various aspects of media, with the arts in particular, which is always very much involved in archetypes. And when it was counterculture, it was most vibrant, at least as far as we're concerned in the West. When it took on broader cultural values, meaning it becomes financially viable. And there's nothing terribly wrong with that, but it is problematic. There's a problem there. Because you can have something that's financially viable, but it has to be about relationships. The way we do it in the West is it's always transactional. It's fee for service. It's about what I want here and now and what I'm going to get, rather than how am I supporting or buying into something or creating something for the future. That's relationships, not transaction. So I think to try and answer that question completely in that context, we have noticed that the quality of students that we have are not quite what they were, say, 30 years ago. That most of the teaching that we do now is more remedial and than it was compared. We don't really do a lot of, quote, real esoteric teaching. I mean, serious esoteric work. A lot of this stuff is mostly a form of psychology, advanced psychology, if you want to call it that. Getting people ready for inner work rather than the actual inner work itself. They don't handle the pressures well. They crumble, which is not good for initiation. You're not going to get far on the path.
Yeah.
This is not unique to esotericism, but needs to be firmly understood by the listeners. This is a culture-wide phenomenon across almost all disciplines.
Yeah.
I know many people who teach in a variety of levels, and I've seen their curriculums, particularly in the math and sciences, where the rigor has gone down considerably. Now, the problem here is, and this goes back to an interview I did with David Metcalf, and again, this is going to be a prediction I made, a prediction I stand by. What you're going to see now is increased bifurcation. Those who have it, they got it. Those who don't have it and aren't willing to develop it, they go by the wayside. So that bifurcation only increases over time in terms of wealth, education, status, spiritual development even.
And what would be the consequence of that?
The consequences are profound because it's really a destruction of the middle. And esotericism in the West has always relied upon a vibrant middle class.
Yeah.
It's always been a middle class phenomena, even when it's had even in its newest renditions where you have all these trust fund babies, financing, Buddhist sanghas and different ashrams. Even that's getting a little sticky now. That's kind of slightly old money by now. That's money starting to age. It's getting a patina on it. Not everywhere, but it's there. We're seeing it. We're seeing a strong patina on a lot of the money that was keeping different organizations afloat. I don't want to name them because I don't want to embarrass them, but we're seeing a lot of the traditional organizations that were around for 100 years that are barely able to keep themselves afloat in large cities like New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles. We see a reversion to a popular culture approach to try and keep the money flowing in. And a culture in its own right is not a problem, but it's not a tradition. It's not a path. It's entertainment.
Yeah.
So that cycles back to where do most people get their spiritual, again, notion of invisible. I want to keep defining that so we understand the world of causes, an invisible world of causes that affects this dimension. Where do most people get their education from? And they're getting it from media. And, media, whether it be Harry Potter or Ghostbusters or, psychic, series where they go to hunt ghosts of some kind or paranormal investigators. That is not a spiritual tradition. That is not a practice. That is not continuity. And those are ideas and not necessarily accurate reflections of reality. So we're really in trouble. I'm going to say that we're really in trouble in terms of a lot of things: quality of teachings, quality of teachers. And
when you say we, can you say who you exactly mean? We as occultists or we more generally?
I think both. We as a societally in the West. I think in the East too, but I don't pay too much attention to that because it's not my concern. And they have their own issues to be concerned with.
Yeah.
India has always had a host of very good and very lousy gurus. They've always, China, being communist, has destroyed itself, its own traditions that somehow they managed to slightly reinflate for tourists. Taiwan has managed to keep alive some of the old teachings on Taoism in some areas. And you see a slight reinvigoration of even Buddhism. And they've, of course, managed to step back on Tibet and allow some rebuilding.
Yeah,
but they destroyed it. So, when you destroy something that thoroughly, rebuilding it, and it gets rebuilt. Who's rebuilding it? It's a lot of Western money too. So I think we have to understand that the context we're in, there's a great deal of things available to us. Yeah. And that's what gives the impression of things being really great. But if you were a nutritionist and this were a grocery store, how many things would you keep? You as a professional performer, someone who really understands music and value, if you were to go into some of these superstores of music, how many things would you really say are essential?
Absolutely.
And it's the same way here.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you like to make maybe more short term usually, but you like to make predictions. You do it every beginning of the year. So the new year will be coming up soon. We're all expecting what we're going to have to say. Would you want to make a middle and long-term prediction on where you think that will be going? Do you have any insight personally in that?
We meaning who?
And where occultism is going in that case?
Oh, I think it's the bifurcation. It's just going to continue. Again, we're really good at three things. We're extremely good at podcasts. We're extremely good at publishing, gourmet books, self-publishing, and we're really good at products, merch. We've become the rock star phenomenon.
The famous 3 Ps.
The 3 Ps. It's no longer perfect, peace, profound. It's podcasts, publishings, and products. We're extremely good at that. And that's okay for now, but it has to turn into some kind of longevity or continuity of teaching. And a teaching is only of value if it has a method of practice where that I can have some degree of insight or a similar insight, or even as Jesus said, you will do even greater things than I. So whereas I will have that potentiality and that possibility of having these even more profound insights and experiences than, say, the author, the founder, the teacher, what have you. We have to start thinking in that direction. What is this doing? This is nice for now, but what are we doing for the future? Because we are entering a period of Saturn. That's restriction. That's going to be strong restriction in terms of resources. Right. Things are going to be very local. That doesn't mean you're not going to have train service. You will. You just may not have it as often. You just may not be able to afford it. Look at the price of airline tickets. Okay? I mean, you still can go anywhere you want. You just can't go as often.
Absolutely.
So you have to think in terms of local, regional.
Could it be, I don't know, but could it be that restriction, as you describe it just now, a material restriction would open new ways of seeing spirituality and maybe help you to concentrate more on what is essential?
Oh, it definitely has that possibility, but it's a possibility. And, we look to certain examples, and I'll give 2 off the top of my head. I'm looking for more, I think, but I haven't come across enough. So if any of the listeners out there can give me examples, please feel free to send them the names. One is, who was it? He was the former head of the OTO who had a profound practice when he was in one of the concentration camps. And he said that he had experienced knowledge and conversation with his guardian angel there. We see the Italian founder of psychosynthesis, Roberto Azangiali, being in a prison during the war. I think it was during the war. Maybe it was before the war, but I think it was during the 40s. And he had stated that was one of the most productive inner periods of his life.
Yeah.
We see examples of Tibetan lamas using their time in imprisonment and torture to deepen their practice. Now, this is really significant because how many people out there are going to be able to do that? Remember, they were in prison together. They had a community even in the prison. You had people who were deeply disciplined and trained, like the two other fellows, individuals I just mentioned. So the pressure, the weight, the pressure, the confinement of Saturn has the potential to bring that out in you if you're open to it, if you have training to do it, if you have an inclination already. If not, well, Saturn does what Saturn does.
And in a longer term thinking, I mean, take different systems, we mentioned already the age of Aquarius. We're saying it's going to be a spiritual age. We are just at the beginning of that. Then you have the famous Kali Yuga discussion that's going on, and then the crisis will come, and then it'll turn to be a more spiritual world. What about that longer term? How is your view on that? What do you see? Where do you think things could be going there?
Well, if we look astrologically, we look at the first 20 years and the next 20 and 20 after. And, I've had people sit in front of me and tell me that not to worry, things are going to go to crap, but in 10 years, everyone's going to be on this awakened heart level. But I never get a real understanding of what that means. There's never any details on that. I'm a belt and suspenders kind of guy. So, I want to see I have a plan B. What's plan B?
Yeah.
And the details, the devil's in the details. How does that work out? Because, as one Lama said to me, it's kind of funny. I tell people this. I said, well, if you're right now, really only about 1% of the population, little or roughly, is involved in this, what we think of as esotericism, it's always the 1%. And, when we look at the other numbers, it gets down lower. So if you have a population that is dramatically reduced by 90%, of course, almost everyone's going to be involved in spirituality because you've eliminated 90% of the population. And then they look at me like, well, that's what we're talking about here in theory on one level, not on all levels, but on one. And that's just to kind of shake the wake up call that there's no free ride here. We're talking about. Now, of course, there's others who will say to me, I've had one say that we're going to enter a terrible period in the next year or two. It's going to be really crappy for about 3 or 4 years. I mean, terrible. Countries pulling apart, all this kind of stuff. But then everything's going to come back together again. And these are smart people. These are intelligent people who've held high positions, who normally you'd be listening to. I said, but history. When has that ever happened in history? You can't just pull a country apart and then put it back together again. That's the guy, But you can if you have a totalitarian regime.
Yeah.
You can if the savior comes in. And when that savior comes in on a white horse with a sword, they're not coming in, you either get in line or you get out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a very chaotic situation, sure. Well, National Socialism. A terribly chaotic time in Central Europe. 2 forces, both battling control. Germany was going to lose no matter who came into power. It didn't matter. But that's my point. When you have when the center falls apart, then the only thing that will bring it back together is a strong man. So, and you saw examples of that with Saddam Hussein. He said that about it. So the only way this country is going to hold together is by a guy like me. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but that's what that's the view. So you have to look at, the different predictions people have. I don't subscribe to either of those, by the way. I don't think those are accurate predictions. I think if we look at the next 20 years, it's going to be one of constriction and restriction. It's going to be very energy intensive and energy dependent. You're going to see an incredible bifurcation technologically. Those who have are going to get more. Those who don't are going to end up having less. That's just the way it's going to be. The skills you want to get into, I'm just going to give you some freebies here, is anything that has to do with repair. Yeah. Low tech is going to be the new high tech.
Mm.
And it's going to happen slowly because people aren't going to be paying attention to it until it hits.
They don't believe it can happen in the beginning, right?
They don't believe it because they don't have a historical view. I can look back and see the way different places were in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and I can chart the arc of their decline. And I can see people say, oh, but that's just, no, it's not temporary. If it's temporary, why isn't it going on for 40 or 50 years?
Mm.
Because then if it's on, then you say, well, where does it end? How does it end? Now, another aspect of this Kali Yuga thing is to think of these yugas or cycles are sub-cycles upon sub-cycles too. So they also represent our individual level of awakening, our individual capacity. So if you can get yourself into that golden age in here, then you're good to go no matter what is happening out there. And then, you know, as the Vajrayana Tibetans, Buddhists like to talk about the Shambhala, you know.
Yeah.
Christians like to think of the New Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
Prester John, the lost country. So that's why inner awakening is so important, so that you can begin to see reality as it is. And this is where I like to get into trouble with predictions is a lot of people who make predictions, particularly through psychic means here, tarot cards, astrology, gazing, spirit guides, numeral, whatever, pick something, pick a system of divination. You know, you just look back at all the people you knew who are making predictions about the last election. And if they were wrong, you might want to get a new clairvoyant or a new seer. And I say that because people often are terrible at making predictions because they can sense certain things, but their own filters prevent them from seeing reality as it is or the potentials.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that with people who don't have a good sense of history.
Mm-hmm.
Astrologers who don't have a good sense of history always have things happening either much quicker or more dramatic than they normally would be.
Okay.
Do you understand?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah. I wasn't aware of it, but I see what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. When you start thinking, well, okay, when does you ask yourself that question? When was the last time that happened? Okay, never. So what makes me think you're going to have a country fall apart and then get back the United States, pull into 8 separate areas, and then 4 years later, everything's going to be fine again? What?
Yeah.
I need some details here because that's never, ever happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is where people who, if you're going to go and get into the area of forecasting, making predictions, it's important that you understand history, politics, psychology, and economics. And most of our folks don't.
Mm-hmm.
So you really need to know that, and you need to talk to other people who do forecasting on a professional level too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So before, I talk to other people who do this and give government presentations. They present to governments and defense,
right.
And we compare. Now, we all have different methods.
Sure.
They don't always know, but behind that is then it has to have some level of support.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to say, okay, just like blank in this period of time, it's going to be similar to this.
Mm-hmm.
So, for those of you who have a good education, think of Montaigne's period in France. That's probably what you're going to see a lot of things like.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of civil disruption and discontent that ebbs and flows. But now you better have a sense of Renaissance history for that to make sense.
So understanding what it means, exactly.
So sophistication, to answer your question, to finish it off, you need to have a more complex historical lexicon, but that also means we need to have a more complex, more sophisticated spiritual lexicon. And that only comes from tradition, and tradition is continuity of practice and information and data from generation to generation.
Yeah. Now, building on that, exactly on that, what would you suggest or what would you ask from a person who is interested in developing that in him and herself. And in order also to carry it out, once you have developed it in yourself, they are listening to this show and they would say, okay, I understand what Mark means, but what can I do? How can I go there?
Well, you can sign up for some of our classes. You can take part in our question and answer session twice a month. That gives you some community. That gives you some continuity. You can look in your area and see what kind of groups are near you.
And what type of groups should they look for?
Well, that's it. That's the problem, isn't it? People often don't know what they want. They have to go to the buffet. And the sooner you go to the buffet and try more things and get some indigestion, the quicker you're going to find out what is maybe good for you and what isn't. So it really is having to go and open yourself up to a lot of unpleasant experiences quickly so that you can learn from them. And then find out, okay, these people, they seem to know what they're doing. They seem to be people I can trust. And that's the other thing. Anybody can sign up for our courses. Anybody can attend our conferences.
Also,
but not everybody
have to be local, right?
They don't have to be local. But in terms of a relationship, I have to trust you.
Yeah.
And you see, and this is it. If you're going to go to a lodge, we'll say a lodge or a chapter or some kind of occult group or esoteric group, you don't have to like the people there. You don't even have to agree with them because you're not going to, but you have to be able to trust them.
I think that's very crucial. That's what I often say also in the case of Masonry, but you can bring that to other groups. We are brethren, so that means we didn't choose the family, we choose the idea, right? And we don't have to be friends, we are brothers. That's something completely different in my view. And I think that's often mixed up also in occult groups, that you don't have to go out and have a drink afterwards. You can if you want, but that's not why you're going there. Right?
That's it. Why are you here? What do you expect from this relationship?
Right.
What do you bring to it? I think that, give a little insight into Masonry. We don't have it in many jurisdictions here anymore. I don't know what it's like in Europe, but it's such a tricky thing. Masonry is so complex in the U.S. There's a thing known as the Chamber of Reflection. And this is not secret. You can look this up. In the Chamber of Reflection, it was the first thing a candidate into Masonry would be exposed to. And in it would be an hourglass, a candle, a mirror, a skull, a pen, and a piece of paper at minimum. These would be the bare minimum.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that you would look up in the mirror and the hourglass is ticking. Remember, these are all Saturnian signs of Saturn, of initiation, of terminus, of the end of life. And you would write on the piece of paper your Masonic will. And what that meant is why you want to join the lodge. And I have never seen it done this way. Once, something like it. But in theory, they would take it and they would read it to the body of the lodge, and the lodge would vote on it, and then they would burn it.
We do that.
And it was, they do, yeah.
I did in the French-speaking lodge here in Austria. Yes.
The French lodges, yes. And it's beautiful because it's asking you a single question.
Yeah.
Why are you here?
You give the ashes to the candidates. Yes.
Well, I got to tell guys that. I think that's what they should do. Because I've only seen it in one place. And it's asking you the question, why are you here?
Right.
Why do you want to join this group? Why are you here? But it's not just why are you here and why do you want to join this group? Why are you here on this planet?
Of course.
Why are you here? What are you doing here? What are you making of your life here?
Yeah. Finding the true will, as others say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe you don't have to find it. Maybe just go do something and it'll reveal itself instead of navigating.
Look for it. Yes, look for it. Yeah. Yeah. Very true. Very true. Finding is not the point. Looking for it is probably the point, is it?
I think so. I think because the journey is the revelation. That's the experience. That's the hard experiences. So when we get into a group, an occult group, and we find out that we're having trouble with the members, then that gives us opportunity to ask ourselves, is it the members? Is it us? Could be. You never know. What's the reason for this? It forces us to reflect and then it forces us to ask how we're going to do this. When we bring up the notion of our ideals, our fraternal ideas of being brothers and sisters in this organization, then we say, are we going to bring this up and talk about it? Or are we going to turn it into some kind of moralizing where we then create these political litmus codes and all this kind of stuff? Because at the end of the day, I have to trust you.
Yeah.
I have to try, and in the teacher too. The teacher does, there's different kinds of teachers. That's the other thing. I'm going to tell you this. I'm firmly convinced that you get the teacher you deserve. Because look, even if he were alive, Einstein's not going to waste his time teaching me physics. You're a professional performer. You're not going to waste your time teaching beginner level stuff to someone. I mean, you might out of a courtesy to a friend or family, something, or you might, if, back in the day, you needed the extra cash. But at a certain point in your professional career, you're expecting that the students come in with a certain performance level.
Yeah.
And that you're going to build with that. And it's the same way in esotericism. And this is a very difficult point. The saints do not waste their time with fools. And the notion of democracy, that we're all equal, doesn't apply. We're equal in potentiality. We're equal in that the law of karma applies to us. But the spiritual dimension, just like nature, is hierarchical. And in here, the hierarchy has to do with your capacity to bear the weight, to bear the pressure of unfiltered reality, or should I say increasingly unfiltered reality.
Right.
And I think of it in those terms, and suddenly this is not about right or wrong or good or evil or what I like or don't like. Can I bear the increasing weight of experiencing and knowing unfiltered or increasingly unfiltered reality, the pure light of my own beingness and of beingness around.
Right. Even if this almost sounds like a final word for our discussion here, I have one last question for you because I just had to ask it to you. I'm running a series on Thoth-Hermes every month about the relationship between science and occultism. And it's rather fascinating with quite interesting people and a co-host. I run it there. And I wondered, while we were speaking about where is this all going, and I sometimes have the impression, but I don't know if I'm right at all, that things like quantum physics, quantum mechanics, many people say that occultism and that part of science somehow get very close at some point. Could you imagine that one part of a maybe more positive future for occultism could also be in finding a way of bringing science again, because it happened in 5,000 years ago at least, that those two rivals at the moment would find a common way again? Do you see any chance for that, or is this just a dream one might have nowadays?
I think it's a little of both. I think at the present time, it's a little bit of a dream and not terribly desirable.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason being is, I'll share with you without giving away too many details, is I had a call maybe 2 years ago from a fellow who all of you'd recognize. You'd recognize his name and who he worked for. And at some point in the conversation, I said, okay, what is it that you really want to know? Why are we really talking here? Because you could tell he's like holding back. And he said, in theory, you're familiar with this different ideas around physics, right? And I said, quantum physics and all that. He goes, yeah. I said, well, a little bit. I said, it's not my specialty, but I get the general, coffee table book idea. He said, well, in theory, is it possible that maybe when you're dealing with some of this technology, like they do at the CERN or elsewhere, that you could kind of accidentally bring something back? Well, I said, well, the question is back from where? And the question is, were you trying to put something over there to begin with? And he was really nervous. He was clearly a man who was upset.
Okay.
I would say his word scared even. And I said, so yes, the answer is yes, it is possible to bring something back. And the problem is by the time you find out, it's going to be too late and you're not going to really know what to do with it, if you know how to do anything with it.
Yeah.
So the problem is that we have a technology that, and we stated this probably 20 years ago, that is already operating just on the other side of what we'll say of duality.
Yeah.
We said that 20 years ago, so they're already there. Okay, so we just don't have the wherewithal as a people. And occultists, I blame you. You guys got to step up. You got to grow a pair of balls and put on your big boy pants. Get some courage here and begin to work together to have a vision of a world that is going to be more healthy, productive. Not in the particulars of who you want to be president or not president, but you have to start having positive regard for your places where you live and for the people around you, and positive regard for what it means to have some limits put on you and what it means to be an adult, and start taking responsibility for building a better vision. And I don't like the word better, so let's use the word more beautiful. How about that? Vision of the future. You have to start doing that. Because if you don't, you're just going to be open to whoever else does.
Right.
And the people who are doing it, you clearly don't like, but you're not willing to create an alternative. Even in quiet, even in the silence where it needs to be, in the silence of the lodge, in the silence of your own meditations, in the silence of your own efforts to do something in your community. We have to talk about duty here. What is your duty? What is your duty to yourself? What is your duty to your family? What is your duty to your community? What is your duty to your gods, your lodge? That's part of that virtue vice thing we talked about earlier, is duty, not just what's in it for me. So I just want to emphasize that, because there's people out there that are doing really wild stuff, and we could talk about it at length, but I don't think a lot of our listeners would understand that the people who tell me this are the ones involved in it. I'm not getting it from somebody else's show. Okay. So, and they're concerned where this is going. So the thing that's going to get us back on the path of righteousness, of the Vedic, of Jupiter, of all that goodness, is going to be some personal discipline, but also with it a joyfulness of saying, I'm going to work together with others, even if it's just 2 or 3 people, and we're going to do our very best to bring beauty into this world, actualize ourselves as much as possible. Leave something, have a plan, leave something for the future. And that's what we at the Institute are doing. We'll do the plug here with the Institute for Hermetic Studies collection at the University of Scranton, which is a Jesuit institution, where we are now placed upwards to, we're moving around 500 volumes on alchemy, Kabbalah, astrology, various esoteric topics, psychic research, UFOs even, the good stuff. and making it available in the region's premier academic research institution. So for the researchers, the academic researchers that we're just talking about, it's there. And it's also going to be available through interlibrary loans, so other people have access to it. So we're doing our best to provide something for the future, to begin to shape that future. But it takes effort and sacrifice and decisiveness. So all of those powers of the Sphinx. So if we can do it, you guys can do it too.
Well, that was now really the good final word. Well, Mark, thank you once again for a great talk. It's always a pleasure to meet you and to speak. So let's that not have been the last time, but thank you for this time, and well, good luck with all your projects.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all your help. And again, guys, those listening, if you can think of any names of people who we can use as good examples as spiritual practitioners,
right,
maybe a biography or two or book, please let me know.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Bye.
Murasaki Muraiki. Thanks, Carl Jung, for providing us the music, this beautiful music that you performed, and which can be found on that CD, Lost in the Wood, with many other tracks, those 3 pieces of that we played here today, with many other tracks on that CD. And thank you also, Mark Stavish, for again, very interesting and very very interesting talk, providing a lot of things to learn and to think about. I think Mark always has a way of saying things that make us think, sometimes a bit provocative, but in a good way. Well, provocation is a good thing because it makes us think and makes us go further. And, well, as we said, gnosis ton, recognize ourselves, and from there start the development. And a bit in the same thought. Well, isn't occultism always thinking like that? But next week, we're going to have a guest again with Chuck Dunning, Charles Dunning, or Chuck, as people call him who know him well. He has recently released a new book that we are going to talk about, and it's very much centered around Hermeticism and Freemasonry and their relationship. But it's not just for Masons, it's really for everyone who is interested into esotericism in the Western tradition and about occultism. So Charles Dunning will be my guest next week. Yes, this week's episode was delayed by 1 week. That's why we have already a new episode next week. Just for your memory, next week, Chuck Dunning. Then the week after, it's Thoth-Hermes podcast again, which will be out with our third part of that series on science and occultism. And my guest and our guest, together with my co-host Karin, will be Dean Radin from the Institute for Hermetic Sciences. And we already have a guest planned for the end of the month, for December, on the Panosophers podcast. But that you will find out once you listen to the next episode, and I will announce the following guest. Right. So this was it for today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being the people who make this podcast possible. And if you return next week or the other week, or if in between you want to listen to the previous episodes, do not miss out the Panosophers.com website. There's lots of stuff to read also there. And for the time being, I say, take care, stay tuned, hear you soon.